Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of today's top stories. The Twitter board met on Sunday to seriously consider Elon Musk's bid to buy the company. Today they reached an agreement. Musk's offer has been accepted and the company is selling to the Tesla CEO for $44 billion. Individual acts of spirituality, which may be interpreted as being religious, have long been accepted in our culture. Whether a professional baseball player blesses himself before stepping up to the plate, or a football player takes a knee in the end zone after scoring a touchdown to thank God for his good fortune. However, a high school in Washington state has suspended a football coach for similar acts, and this case has now reached the Supreme Court. We'll bring you the details. U.S. officials met with Ukraine's president this weekend, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd traveled to Kyiv to hold talks. Meanwhile, the war rages on. We'll have more on what these world leaders had to say. Twitter today accepted Elon Musk's offer to buy the company. Twitter and Musk reached an agreement that valued the company at around $44 billion in cash. This comes after last week's announcement that Musk had lined up the funding for the purchase. Musk has said that he will transform Twitter into a private company and have it serve as a global platform for free speech. Earlier in the day, Musk tweeted out, "I hope that even my worst critics remain on Twitter because that is what free speech means." A case on religious freedom. The Supreme Court today considered a dispute between a public school and a football coach. A school district in Washington state put a coach on paid leave because he wanted to kneel and pray on the field. For years, Coach Joseph Kennedy led students in prayer after games. The school district stopped him after learning what he was doing. Kennedy's lawyers say the Constitution allows him to pray on the field, with students free to join. But the school district argues that the coach's religious speech interfered with students' rights who may have felt pressured to pray, opening the district to a potential lawsuit. At issue is whether Kennedy's prayers amounted to governmental speech or a private act separate from his official duties. Kennedy is appealing a lower court's ruling that sided with the school district. The Supreme Court is expected to make a decision before its summer recess. Jay Richards is a senior fellow in religious liberty and civil society at the Heritage Foundation, and we're happy to have him on to discuss. Jay Richards, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
My pleasure.
Jay, Coach Joe Kennedy, a high school football coach at Bremerton High School in Washington State, his case is heading to the Supreme Court, where both sides are arguing religious liberty is at stake. What can you tell us about this case?
Well, Coach Kennedy's actually been through an ordeal that's lasted almost 8 years. I mean, it's really a simple case. He had pledged to God as a Christian that he was going to pray by himself after every football game at Bremerton High School, and so he would do that by himself. He'd pray at the 50-yard line. Initially, it was just him kneeling and praying silently, and then over time, some students and different people asked if they could join him. He said, "Sure. I mean, it's a free country. You can join me if you want." So this was not him inviting people. It was people joining in, and even other players sometimes for some games from opposing teams. So it's really not in any way disruptive and clearly not a government endorsement of religion. But the school district in Bremerton, Washington decided, well, this is too much of an explicit display of religion. And so they kept adding conditions, which he would do his best to meet. But essentially, eventually they were basically saying, okay, you can't express your religious beliefs in any way during school time, and so essentially forbade him even from doing a silent private prayer after a football game. And so they first suspended him and then actually fired him. And so this has been going through the courts now for years, to the district court and to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. It's finally reached the Supreme Court, which I think I'd say is probably good news in the long run for Coach Kennedy.
Jay, you touched upon it a few times where you basically said that this coach here was individually, expressing his religion. Could this lead to individual expressions like this, say, of people wearing a cross or, say, a yarmulke being purged from our schools?
I think it's absolutely the case. In fact, I think that implication is precisely why the Supreme Court has taken this up, because the Bremerton School District essentially said that he can't express his religious belief while on school time. Now, that might, in his case, it was a silent prayer kneeling after a football game, but as you said, it could be a cross or a yarmulke or just any sort of indicator of religion, so that we've moved since the infamous case banning school prayer in 1962, which said official school prayer in schools was unconstitutional. We moved from that to, in Bremerton School District, essentially a hostility to any public display of religious belief, no matter how voluntary. And so I think the Supreme Court recognizes that that's a dangerous bridge to cross. And frankly, my own view is that we've moved way past the actual guarantees and promises of the First Amendment to explicit hostility toward religion in the public square.
Jay, sometimes when we see these high-profile cases, I think it gives us the impression that these are isolated instances or incidents. Is this part of a greater culture war that's been going on?
I think this has honestly been happening for over 50 years. The famous case of Engel in 1962, as I mentioned, banned school prayer, something that had been practiced from the beginning of the American experiment, non-sectarian prayer to God. God has never been in the American experiment treated as a merely private or sectarian thing. God is a public reality that we recognize in our public institutions. And so we started with a ban on even non-sectarian prayer. And now these just really blatant acts of, frankly, hostility toward religious expression, even when it's entirely voluntary. I mean, it would be one thing if the coach were making the prayer a requirement for his football team or something like that. But here we're dealing in the most explicit way with a voluntary prayer in which no one's being coerced. He's doing it after the game. And so I think the Supreme Court is noticing this trend, and I'm really hopeful that they will help restore the original constitutional balance in which we don't prohibit the free exercise of religion in the course of avoiding an establishment of religion.
Jay, if you could you just put the separation of church and state into the proper context for us?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a separation of church and state, in fact, that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, people often think is in the Constitution. It's not. It's actually a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Church Association because they were being persecuted for their religious beliefs. And so he refers to this wall of separation. But if you read the First Amendment, it, on the one hand, says that there's not going to be an establishment of religion at the national level, which at the time of the founding would have probably been a Protestant Christian denomination, but it also prohibits the government from preventing the free exercise of religion. And we had that balance in this country for practically 200 years after the founding. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, the legal scholars had moved toward frankly, a more secularist attitude in which the public square has to be purged of any religious expression or even any reference to God. And I think that's been working its way through our courts and our institutions for decades now. I'm really hopeful that the current Supreme Court will restore that balance so that, look, public expression of religious belief is a perfectly fine thing, and in fact, it's encouraged. It's been a part of our history, and we should not be trying to purge religious expression from public institutions.
Jay Richards, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
My pleasure.
In the nation's capital this weekend, spiritual practitioners of Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, gathered in front of the Chinese embassy to fight for their freedom to believe.
At the Washington, D.C.-based Chinese embassy, a group of around 60 people gathered, joined by tens of thousands of more people around the world. They're calling for freedom of faith to be restored in China.
Through practicing Falun Gong, I learned how to be a good person. It's that simple. So when they said bad things about Falun Gong, I truly felt painful from the bottom of my heart.
She was one of over 10,000 people who, on this day 23 years ago, stood in front of Beijing's appeals office to ask the authorities to release around 50 Falun Gong practitioners who had been arrested.
No one spoke, no one shouted, no one walked. We just stood there, some reading, some sitting.
And 23 years after that first massive peaceful protest outside of the Chinese government headquarters, Falun Dafa practitioners around the world continue to peacefully protest and push for an end to the persecution. And they're urging the Chinese government to allow them to peacefully practice their spiritual faith Here's their message.
Simple reason, because the Falun Dafa teach truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and help me to become a better person. And I think this is my fundamental right.
We are good people. They were wrong. My message to them: understand the truth. Join this trade-on movement as soon as possible. One courageous Chinese quit the party every 2 seconds.
Unfortunately, many practitioners who have fled to other countries cannot return to China because they could face persecution for practicing their faith. Some Congress members have denounced the CCP's suppression of the spiritual practice. Representative Scott Perry told NTD the bravery of Falun Gong that day continues to give courage to the millions around the world who believe in and yearn for an end to CCP repression. Congressman Chris Smith called on his fellow Congress members to join him in support to pass his bill, aimed at, quote, combating human trafficking and the harvesting of organs, and penalize countries that engage in or tolerate such inhumane savagery.
And this is large-scale genocide happening in China, still ongoing for more than 23 years. Especially many Falun Gong practitioners are the victim of organ harvesting.
The spiritual practitioners tell NTD that it's not only up to governments to take action. They're urging every person to hear the facts and in their hearts make a decision to stand against the CCP suppression and side with humanity. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy in Kyiv over the weekend. The two U.S. officials pledged continued support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia.
What more we can do to add additional capability. So you should know, the people of Ukraine should know that we will continue to do everything possible to ensure that you're successful. So.
As a further sign of our commitment, I intend to announce the return of our diplomats to Ukraine.
During a portion of the meeting open to the press, Zelenskyy thanked the U.S. for helping Ukraine. He also said Ukraine's priority is getting additional weapons from the United States and European allies, as well as convincing world leaders to impose more sanctions on Russia. And former President Trump is being held in contempt of court by a New York judge. He's now required to pay a $10,000 fine every day until he turns in documents that were requested by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. James's office has been investigating the Trump Organization for more than 2 years for allegedly being involved with fraudulent or misleading financial conduct. For this investigation, Trump has been asked to provide documents, but so far has not done so. Trump's lawyers have said the document requests were overboard and that Trump simply does not have the types of written communications that are being sought. Trump's attorneys also note that he has produced hundreds of thousands of documents already. Now he's required to pay tens of thousands of dollars in fines until the New York court is satisfied. But Trump's lawyers say they will appeal the judge's ruling. And here's the latest on Trump's lawsuit against Hillary Clinton. Michael Sussman, Clinton's former campaign lawyer, will go to trial on May 16th for allegedly lying to the FBI in 2016 about a secret channel between Donald Trump and a Russian bank. A judge today ordered that a former FBI special agent, David Martin, can testify during Sussman's trial. But the FBI agent cannot testify on the accuracy of the data Sussman conveyed. The judge also ordered that a new bit of evidence from the CIA will not be permitted to enter the trial. What's the biggest espionage threat facing the United States? The FBI director is pointing to one country, and it's not Russia. And what are we doing about it? Solomon Yu sits on the Republican National Committee in Oregon, and he knows firsthand the lengths the CCP will go to infiltrate and spy in the United States. We'll bring you his take coming up. D.C. Police Chief Robert Contee stood with Mayor Muriel Bowser to give an update after dozens of shots were fired toward a D.C. private school on Friday, injuring 4 people. The chief said things could have been a lot worse and many lives could have been lost. He explains why that did not happen. Amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the FBI says the U.S. is facing an unprecedented level of espionage from Beijing.
The biggest threat we face as a country from a counterintelligence perspective is from the People's Republic of China, and especially the Chinese Communist Party.
Speaking in a Sunday CBS interview, FBI Director Christopher Wray said the current scale of Beijing's espionage and cybersecurity threats is unprecedented in history. He also noted China has a hacking program larger than that of every other major nation combined.
They have stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than every nation combined.
Wray says that the FBI is opening a new China counterintelligence investigation about every 12 hours, and there are well above 2,000 active cases already. Meanwhile, CIA Director William Burns was also warning of Beijing's unique threats just a week ago.
A silent partner in Putin's aggression, Xi Jinping's China is our greatest challenge, in many ways the most profound test that CIA has ever faced.
Burns identified China as the single greatest geopolitical challenge in the 21st century.
In the last few years, Beijing has hacked at least 150 U.S. companies to steal secrets. It is trying to increase its nuclear arsenal to 1,000 warheads. It has detained 1 million of its own citizens simply because they are Muslim, and arrested thousands more in Hong Kong for peacefully supporting democracy.
Meanwhile, several U.S. senators are pushing for the Department of Justice to reinstate a Trump-era program dubbed the China Initiative to fight spying from Beijing. And here to assess the threat of Chinese espionage with first-hand knowledge of the lengths that the CCP goes through to influence our leaders in the highest levels of government, we have Solomon Yu, committeeman for Oregon's Republican National Committee. Solomon Yu, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Happy to be with you, Steve.
Solomon, the FBI Director Christopher Wray just recently appeared on 60 Minutes, where he said that China is the biggest counterintelligence threat facing the United States. Do you concur, and if so, how?
Absolutely, I concur, and I have first-hand knowledge of that. If you check your signal, I sent you 2 pictures. One of the pictures, the gentleman's name is David Wang. David Wang is chairman of Chinese Americans for Trump 2016 from Los Angeles. I got a call from Intel community that David Wang also was involved in patriotic Chinese and students and tourists to demonstrate against Filipino Consul General's office in Los Angeles because Filipinos did a demonstration against Chinese embassy in Manila that year. And so he is a green card holder, Chinese national. So he did he organized a Chinese, patriotic Chinese demonstration in front of Filipino Consul General's office in Los Angeles. Now, the minute I learned this, next thing I learned was he became RNC major donor for RNC event featuring then Vice President Pence. At that event, his guest was Ms. China from Beijing. The second picture you will see, he was introducing Ms. China to all RNC male donors. Those are major donors. And table by table, Ms. China was giving out a business card. That's the business card. Invite all RNC major donors to visit her in Beijing, China. When you see this, you know that is a honey trap. Yeah, it's there. It happened, and every day.
It's unbelievable the level of infiltration, I think it would just kind of blow people's minds if they actually knew. And so with that in mind, a few months ago, the Justice Department said that it is stopping its Trump-era China initiative due to the name being offensive to Asian Americans. I mean, how big of a threat is China on our homeland, and what do you make of the semantics?
Well, I think we're going backwards. And what we need really is this kind of initiative during Trump administration, and to make sure that we need to expose this kind of stuff. You see something, you say something. And when, in my case, when I got those pictures come to me and I saw what's going on, guess what? I take that to Trump's National Security Agency and let them know this kind of threat is real and doesn't matter. It was happening within my own party, RNC, and major fundraiser. Unbelievable.
Solomon, just to follow up here, do we run the risk of being so politically correct that we wind up putting ourselves in danger, similar to the calls to defund the police, which then resulted in more crime?
Yes. And that's current administration. Biden's administration really concerns me from that perspective, because we don't want to be called a racist by CCP. That's why we want to be kind to what they try to do to us, which is infiltration and deep penetration into our society. My solution is expose them all.
Solomon Yu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Former Senator Orrin Hatch, who represented the state of Utah for 42 years in the United States Senate, has died on Saturday. In a statement following Hatch's death, President Biden said that the former senator was a fighter who carried with him the memory of his humble upbringing near Pittsburgh. Hatch was the longest-serving Republican senator and had retired in 2019. In his last years of service, he chaired the Senate Finance Committee and led the passing of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was signed by then-President Trump. Former Senator Hatch was 88 years old. The Edmund Burke School in Washington, D.C. was closed today to allow for students and staff to get support and care following the sniper shooting that took place on Friday afternoon. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and Metro Police gave updates regarding a dangerous shooting on Friday injuring 4 people near the Edmund Burke private school. Police Chief Robert Contee said a senseless act of violence injured a 12-year-old girl, a retired police officer, and 2 others. The suspect had multiple firearms in a sniper-like setting with a tripod set up near the window of his 5th-floor apartment. There he opened fire toward the school. Chief Robert Contee thanked community members who alerted police of the suspect's location. Police responded immediately.
That's if there's anything that's good that comes out of this, is that not more people than what were hurt ended up being hurt, because there could have been a lot of damage done tonight, more damage done, and lives lost as a result of what this gunman did tonight.
Suspect Raymond Spence is believed to have killed himself when police approached his apartment. And that's all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. Don't forget to check out our Capitol Report podcast, available on all major platforms. We'll also have our full and unedited interviews there. Once again, thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.